Everyone coming in, filter from the back into the centre. Just before I introduce Anna, just a reminder, keep the questions coming through on the app because we'll have a bit of a Q&A at the end. So Anna Bromley is the founder of Agile Project Delivery and we'll be talking about how you should make your plans more collaborative. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Hello everyone, wow, it's bright up here. Thank you so much. I just want to say I appreciate you all coming, spending half an hour, listen to me rant on about why you should make your plans collaborative, but hopefully you get something out of this session. So let's move on to the agenda then. So I've got 4 things that I'm going to talk to you about today. One is planning is hard, and don't I know it, I've got a personal story there to share with you. And then I'm going to go into why collaboration is going to make planning so much easier. And if you collaborate, then it'll make your plans more successful, and then your implementation will be more successful too. So unfortunately it's not the perfect story here because we are not always geared up for collaboration, so I'm going to unpack that a little bit as well. And also why it's important that we set our teams up for success. So my core message from today's talk is basically collaborative plans are traps laid to capture the future. So if you want your plans to come to fruition, then you better collaborate. But before we move on to the main agenda, I just want to run everyone through very quickly a history of planning. And the history of planning basically tracks the history of project management. So we've got the pyramids that were built 5,000 years ago, I think, before the Common Era. So that is the first example of an inspirational vision coming to mind. We don't have any information, not that I know of, about how this was actually planned, but we know that human minds came together and actually made this possible. Next, there was a massive gap somehow, so I'm not sure what humanity did, but we come to the early age. So the early age is really where a lot of the common planning frameworks really kicked off. That includes the Gantt chart, as you might have heard, but a little story about the Gantt chart is that it wasn't actually original. It was a stolen idea of a lesser-known Polish engineer called Karol Adamiecki, who created a similar process called the harmonogram, basically, 20 years earlier. But it's the Gantt chart that was published in English, and it's that which kicked off. So then moving into the golden age. So during the golden age, what we were gifted was something that everyone might know of as the critical path. So if you've got your plan, obviously you need to understand what your tasks are. And so this is what the critical path really gives us, like what is the shortest amount of time to get to our outcome. Moving on to the Silver Age, and this is where everything really does start to speed up because manufacturing explodes in Japan. Japan invents the Kanban. So if you didn't know, Kanban means sign or visual aid, and we have a Kanban to sort of monitor the delivery workflow basically, and also it shows, it communicates the capacity of the team as well at any moment in time. So also during this Silver Age, we saw the invent of the work breakdown structure. So the work breakdown structure is where you're looking at what your overall deliverable is and you're literally breaking it down into different components so it's more manageable to plan and execute. So that was during that period. But then moving on to the rebirth and the modern age, we see more adaptive types of planning and project management coming through. By adaptive, I mean agile, which is a word hopefully many of you are familiar with, but agile sort of stands in direct contrast to more predictive planning methodologies, whereby you understand the scope in advance and you can put in the effort with the upfront planning. So that is the broad foundation, and I'm going to touch on one of the reasons why this is so hard is actually based on the complexity with the different and conflicting planning methodologies. But moving on to that, from that, into a personal story of mine, which elucidates my sort of inferiority when I started planning. So I tell this story quite often, but about 11 years ago, I went to Australia, and this is a picture of an airport there. I was doing an exchange at university. I'd never studied project management before, but I actually studied a module in project management in Australia, so I started understanding the concepts there better. But there I was in Melbourne Airport. It was 40-degree heat. I had no accommodation booked. I had no money on me exchanged up, and I hadn't sorted my phone out so I could ring someone. So there's quite a long list of things that I did wrong. And I obviously just got off a 36-hour flight because I bought the cheapest one because I was a student. So you might say, well, that's not even bad planning, that's just no plan. But I was actually quite a diligent, 20-year-old, and I thought I had made a plan. I had a buddy in Australia, I'd been sending emails, and the problem I had, and the problem everyone has, is that I didn't know what I didn't know. And I'd never been on such a long journey before. I didn't understand the implications of a flight like that I'd need insurance, accommodation, all lined up. I'd never been there before. So what I'm saying here is planning requires a lot of what's called executive function. And executive function is the CEO of the brain, basically. It's that bit that pays attention, it follows through, it remembers things. And we often see this in practice in a work environment when people say, I'm juggling too many things, there's just too much for me to remember, I'm spinning a lot of plates. All of this is an example of the utilisation of executive function. Holding ideas in your working memory that you need to use for decision making at any one time. And this is very taxing on the brain, basically, and it's why many people, when they start out, and when I started out, and someone asked me to create an IT implementation plan for an application migration, I must have sat there for about 3 hours thinking, what does that mean, and what do I actually need to do? So yeah, planning is really difficult. But I want to show you a fun little clip of how the world of film portrays planning, which is quite different.
This is my house. I have to defend it.
Okay, so it's coming up to the holiday season, so many of you would have recognised that was a scene from Home Alone, and many of you might be watching that film this Christmas. But the myth here is that anyone can actually build a plan by themselves. Kevin McAllister is an 8-year-old boy. He just whips out his plan and then he executes flawlessly. It's actually funny from a project management perspective. But there's so much about this scene as it runs on that I really like, and that they get very accurately. So one is that he has a goal. It is my house and I want to defend it. He's got his resources lined up, so you see him go around and he's gathering all of the traps that he's going to lay for the thieves that are going to enter his house and going to rob him of all of his Christmas presents. He shows great determination and initiative and follow through on this plan. So there is so much here to admire, but in effect, it's actually a bit of a myth that you can really achieve this by yourself, hence why it's in a film. So, moving on to another example, which I find very inspiring and is very much grounded in reality, is the Hoover Dam mega project. So the Hoover Dam mega project was widely thought of as the first mega project in our sort of modern history. They started this project in 1931, and there were 3 outcomes of this project. One was to irrigate farmland, so supply water to the southwest of America. Another was to supply power to the west of America, that region. And the third most important reason was there were disastrous floods happening as a result of the water from this river. And so this dam was built to basically stop that. So they had a really clear vision in mind, but the scale of this project was absolutely huge. So just to give you some facts on it. So the project actually lasted 5 years, and there was 3,500 people on average working on this on a daily basis. They had to build a whole new city, Boulder City, to actually even start this project in the first place, because they had, thousands of people to accommodate. They had to build a 222 power supply line from California to the dam site, which is the equivalent of from London to Manchester. So a phenomenal amount of effort was put in with what we call the prerequisite stage. So just gearing the project up for success inevitably. To tie this back to the theme of collaboration and why that's important, is this was the largest government contract of the time, and they didn't give it to one company because that wasn't going to be possible, but they gave it to 6. They gave it to 6 companies that formed a consortium that actually ended up delivering this project. So there was a fantastic amount of collaboration that actually happened here, and they completed it on time and to budget, and I don't even know any projects anymore that happened. So that's why I find this particularly inspiring. But most importantly as well, and I'm going to touch on this when we get to gearing teams up for success with collaborative planning, was the spirit of the individuals. So when I watched first-person accounts of all of the diverse group of people that they pulled from all over America, during a Great Depression, I might add, to work on this project, there was an enthusiasm, there was a desire to get on with it, to be innovative, that people really couldn't make up in this story. And there's two reasons why I know that is the case. So this site was actually built in the desert. So the people that were working and supporting this project were actually working in 45 degrees heat every single day. And the reason I've put this photo here is because I think it gives a nod to the ingenuity of the people. So this is actually one of the vehicles that they used to drill holes in the rock face when they were building the dam. This vehicle was made of wood and steel, and it literally has manual drills, one by one next to them, so that the people could actually drill holes in the rock. And I just can't imagine the amount of effort and perspiration that actually went into that project. So it's very inspiring and a good example of collaboration. So just to remind everyone, my key message for you all today is collaborative plans are traps laid to capture the future. So when I was doing some research for this talk and also some reflection on my own personal experience, what I found was there's generally 3 themes to collaboration that were emerging. One was interpersonal, one was organisational, and one was cultural. And when I was looking into this, I realised that there were several key elements, of which I'm going to go over in a minute. And it was really like a web. So if you removed one aspect, you would definitely weaken the whole structure. So I'll take you through it. So in terms of interpersonal, the things that came up time and time again, that if you didn't get right, you would block collaboration, was number 1 was leadership. So leadership, what is that? So the ability to give direction and instruction to a group of people. Can you imagine the Hoover Dam project without leadership? People wouldn't have known where they were and, or what they were doing effectively. But leadership is also about guidance as well and giving feedback. And when you don't have that leadership on your project, then it's going to weaken your collaboration and then have a knock-on effect on your planning. So the next thing that was really important from an interpersonal perspective was, can you guess it, communication. So this is where I want to sort of draw on the theme of the web structure that emerges here, because you can't have communication if you don't extol some of the culture. I'm going to go over to the cultural theme here, of honesty, respect and empathy. Communication fundamentally, what is it? It's not just sending information, but it's also about hearing what other people are saying. So a large part of communication that's often maybe an afterthought is actually the ability to listen. And it sounds really obvious, but are you really hearing the other person and understanding what they're saying? Because if that quality of communication isn't there, then it's going to have impacts. It's going to have impacts all over this, basically. And leaders fundamentally have to communicate as well. So moving on to a couple of things that are really key on the organisational side of things is team size. So there are really clear studies that show that a team size that's bigger than 3 to 8 people is really going to hinder collaboration because of the amount of complexity with your communication and your relationships at the same time. So some people say that you should be able to share 2 pizzas in a team. So, you know, if that's a greedy bunch, it could be 3 people. If not, it could be 8 to 10 people. And there is some research that suggests that you could possibly expand the team up to a size of 20. But for me personally, in my experience, like having a team that large, it really doesn't foster the collaboration that you need to build successful plans and implement effectively. So that's the first point. The second point is around shared goals. So, and this also connects back to leadership as well, because with shared goals, they need to be incentivized as well. So you can't have a group of people working on a project that are incentivized differently. So, for example, I've seen before that you've got people on a project that are actually incentivized to cut costs, and then you've got people who are incentivized to improve service. So basically that's saving money and spending money, and you're all in the same team. So that's really not going to be very effective at all. So what leaders can do is they can make sure the people on their projects actually have the same shared goals and they are incentivized accordingly. And that's where you get the most success, basically. The third thing on the organisational side that I want to touch on is proximity. So what do I mean by proximity? I mean not that people should be physically in each other's space all the time. Hybrid work and working from home is a very, very topical conversation. I'm sure other people have covered that during this conference. But my personal philosophy on this is we have the digital tools now to aid remote working. Like the tools seem to be good enough, and that's definitely not where I see a gap. The gap that I'm seeing is actually in the resources that businesses provide to foster relationships that are face-to-face at key points in a project. So let me just break that down. What I am saying is businesses aren't focusing enough on providing focused and specific team building face-to-face activities at the start or at the end of a project or point of an organisation, which is particularly important. So, for example, I'm currently working on a project with people from South America, people from India, people from France. There will never be a time where all of these people will come together. The senior leadership don't think that that's important for some reason. It is an expense, but at key points in any project, it is absolutely vital that people come together. And I've seen that work really well as well. So I did spend some time at a social media company, and they thought it was worth the effort to get people together every once in a while in California. and that was tremendously effective at building those relationships and fostering communication. And as I said, all of this really is a web. So as soon as you weaken one part of this structure, then your collaboration is going to be impacted. And lastly, moving on to culture. So from a cultural aspect with collaboration, there were 3 things that came up time and time again. The first was respect. So respect is not just about having regard for another person, but also if you really want to foster a good collaborative environment, it's actually about admiring the people that you work with. That means that you admire their values or their skill set, and they can actually teach you something new. When you work on projects with people that you don't respect, therefore you don't regard or you don't admire them in any way, then it's going to be obviously very difficult to actually collaborate with them. The next point would be about trust, and trust is just connected to collaboration all over this web, basically, because if you don't have communication, you don't have trust. If you don't have good leadership, you won't have trust. If people don't have respect for you, then you're not going to have trust. And also, if you're not able to physically see your team members or speak to them very often, you're also not going to have trust. But trust is also about transparency as well. And so many times in a project or in an organisation, people think that by protecting information and not sharing it, that they're protecting themselves and their own interests, which is when a sort of tribalism is forming and then there's silos emerging. That's obviously not going to help trust, and therefore that's not going to help collaboration. The last point, which is impossible to collaborate without, is empathy. So empathy for our peers, for who we're working for, is very much tied in. So I've just gone through a lot there. So to summarise, basically, from an interpersonal perspective, you've got leadership that's really important, and you've got communication. From an organisational perspective, you've got team size, that's important, the proximity of your team, and there's one other thing I'll come back to if I remember, and shared goals, obviously. And the last thing was culture, so that's respect, honesty and empathy. So that basically, based on my experience and research, these things come up time and time again. And if you want successful plans, then you need successful collaboration, and you're going to need these things. So moving on to this is actually kind of coming to the end of this presentation. I just wanted to talk about some personal experiences, building on the themes that I've just shared, about examples of, collaborative working. And I must preface this by saying I've never actually worked on a team that has got everything spectacularly right in this regard. So the experiences that I've had that's really lent itself well to collaboration are leaders that are amazing project sponsors. So people who are actively engaged with the project, they give their feedback, they turn up to your reviews or your demonstrations, like they're interested, they're engaged, they're asking questions. There is nothing more frustrating, I think, for someone who works in delivery than to be handed a problem child and then the parent doesn't care about it. That's very frustrating, and it doesn't foster collaboration. I've got a pizza and some beer here. This definitely isn't an advert for San Miguel, but the idea that a team should be, it shouldn't be able to eat 2 pizzas it seems to resonate with me. Having a team that's sort of a family size seems to be very optimal. And of course, there can be, external stakeholders, but having that core structure with a shared goal that are incentivized appropriately is a winning formula. And lastly, an aspect that I want to pick up on, which based on sort of the proximity aspect that I've just spoken about, teams work best when you want to be with them. again, another thing that sounds really obvious, but the most collaborative teams I've worked with, I would happily go out for, you know, a coffee with, for example. I'd actually look forward to speaking to them, not just on a professional level, but on a personal level. So that's where, what I'm saying, I see the biggest gap and the biggest opportunity really for organisations to actually bring people closer at key points, because then you really build that trust and that communication at a key time. So they're the main points really. You can contact me, please give us a call. I'm here for the rest of the day, I'm here to network. It'd be super interesting if you have any different opinions to me, especially. Yeah, and I think I'll take any questions.
We have a couple of questions.
Okay.
We're going to start with one actually. You talk a lot about fostering trust, but how do you think you do that really effectively in teams?
Yeah, well, as I just said, I think it's complex and I think it's a web. So you can't foster trust if you don't ever see your team members, like maybe in face-to-face life, or they never put their cameras on, or they never even speak. Like that does actually happen on projects that I've worked on. Again, if you're not being communicated to by your senior leadership, you're not going to trust those people. So it's all of that. There's the if people don't have respect for you, it's everything I just spoke about on 2 slides before. All of that basically builds trust. It's interwoven. It's not a black and white answer. It's building good relationships, being present, having a shared goal, being incentivized, having amazing leaders, being transparent, all of that stuff together, and you can build trust.
Great. And somebody's asked, what do you think planning might look like in 100 years? What comes after Agile and any early signs?
That's actually a really great question, and I forgot to mention that on the history of planning slide. So one of the most interesting things that's emerging at the moment in planning is the use of AI for really run-of-the-mill tasks like risk management and scheduling and things like this, and even check-ins and tracking. So I really think we're going to move to maybe project managers won't be needed and we'll have to find something else to do. I hope so, something very creative. But I think AI is going to play a massive part of it. I don't think you can take the human element out of projects, honestly, to be serious, but definitely machine learning and AI is going to become a big part of our day-to-day job, so we better get learning.
100%. And how does a collaborative approach actually improve plans? So tell us a little bit more about those traps for the future.
Yeah, so I think, like going back to the story I shared with when I went to Australia and I arrived and it was just a terrible mess. I didn't actually share my plan with anyone. You know, I didn't run it past my parents, I didn't run it past my sisters. I didn't ask anyone for advice that had been to Australia before or been on the study abroad programme. I thought I could manage it all for myself, and we really can't. So obviously your implementation is going to be so much more successful if you socialise your ideas and bring people on the same journey. I understand that it's slower and it is really frustrating to do that, but it's gonna make things so much better in the long run. So like short-term pain, long-term gain.
And for, you spoke about being able to share a pizza with the size of a team, and that can obviously be flexible, but on some projects, there really is more than a family size of people on them. And so do you have any tips and advice about how you can improve collaboration in those bigger settings?
It's definitely a difficult one. So this is why frameworks that I haven't mentioned, like scaled agile, for example, kind of come in, but I'm really not a fan of those. What I prefer to do instead is to break things down into the most manageable chunks, really. So if you have an entire platform or an entire project, then what are the constituent parts that you can break those small family of teams up into, so you don't just have this massive blob. Like that is something that we've had to do actually in a project quite recently, where we had a massive engineering organisation and it was really just a mess. So we had to break it down into these small family-sized streams. And unfortunately, it does mean you need more management overhead than you would if you but it would just be carnage if you just left it to be totally organic. But if anyone's doing that, then do speak to me, because I'll be interested to see how that's working out.
Yeah, so break it down.
Break it down.
Yeah, totally. And we've got time for one more question, and actually it's a funny one from somebody in the audience. Favourite pizza topping?
I'm just a margarita type of person. I'm a bit plain. Maybe a bit of a meat feast once in a while. My partner would definitely make me want one of those. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of your tips today. Big round of applause.
Really appreciate you joining. Thanks so much.